Well, here's the shutter. I put the components back into the shutter just so it's complete before I strip it down for servicing. It did come off the body, but not without an awful lot of fighting. I'll tell you more about that later. Anyway, let's get on to the shutter. So you can remove a few parts. I'll start with the little release plunger. The front group is loose. I loosened that earlier. And take the rear group off. You can see there's two little holes I've drilled into the back of that. That was to allow me to get a tool on there to remove the rear group while I was dealing with getting the shutter off the camera body. And there's a little scar through the thread right there as a result. Never mind. So let's get to the front of the shutter and start taking this to pieces. So our lock screw here, it's actually a rivet. We want to expose that, so I'm going to remove the nameplate, and for convenience I'm going to remove it completely. You can just remove one screw, swing the plate out of the way. Looking around for my good screwdrivers, tweezers, and they're hiding. Okay, so this will normally rotate with a pair of fairly stiff tweezers, and you just rotate that to unlock that. Turn this plate anti-clockwise to line up the tabs on the bayonet there, and that should lift off. I'm lifting it off complete with the front ring there, the speed settings cam plate. There's the speed settings cam plate. You can see it's pretty dirty. Unhook the spring here for the main lever. This part's called the main lever. I think the tab on the top's bent. I'll check that later. I want to remove all these components from the release there, so I'm going to hold down the shutter release, which swings this arm down and exposes this hole, so I can get at the screw there. That's where the cable release socket is. That's where that plunger, release plunger, hooks in. This piece here, this is our return lever, has our return spring on it for the shutter release. The spring runs in a little groove in the casing at this point, and I want to get that lifted out of that notch. See if it'll do it for me. Yes, it has. So there's our lever with its return spring. Here is the high speed spring, the spring that gives us the extra power to give us our top speed that's marked at 1/500th of a second. I'm working this shutter release lever off its shaft. It has a fine spring under here which activates this lever, which looks after our B and T speeds. Be careful not to damage that spring. This is the catch that holds the shutter in the cocked position. And that wasn't doing anything very useful for us before. And it may well be that I've got a problem with my cocking ring there. This lever here, does our B and T settings. The end of this is bent down. This should move smoothly. You see it sticks. The lever is actually bent at this point. There's a screw here. And that screw goes through this little brass bush which sits on top of the lever. The collar on that brass bush passes through the centre here, and this has got its return spring here which is fixed to the lever. Careful not to lose that. Leaves us with this little lever here. I'm going to remove that. That's part of the B and T speed settings too. The screw that holds that's a little shoulder screw. Here's the lever itself. Now we just about got this stripped down. This little lever here, that's what opens the shutter blades on the B or T settings. That's when you manually move the shutter release. That'll shift that. I think that'll come off for us. I'm removing more than I normally would because this shutter is exceptionally filthy. That's a shoulder screw again. Keep these shoulder screws with the component that they belong to, otherwise you'll have trouble when you go to put it back together. This is the retard gear train here, and this lever is lifted by the main lever as it releases, and it lifts the pallets. It allows this to run down. This is quite sticky. I'm going to clean that on the main plate here. I'm not going to remove the retard gear train from the plate because it's not easy to set that up again correctly. Generally speaking, you don't need to muck with the settings. If the shutter had been working correctly long ago, when the shutter was either first built or after it was properly serviced by someone with appropriate skills, chances are very high that it'll work appropriately even now once it's been cleaned and lubricated. You shouldn't need to mess with those settings. The screw looks a little bit mutilated at that end, like someone's had a go at it. Okay, so at this point I want to remove the mechanism plate from the case. Now we've got 3 screws here visible in the back of the case. They hold the case and the mechanism plate together. Those screws will be all identical. Put those to one side. And the case should just lift off. So here we have our case with the diaphragm components. As you can see, they're very oily and very dirty. There's a lot of dirt in here. A lot of that is probably corrosion too. That's some of the oiliness potentially here is from me squirting that CRC 556 round the back here, but I think that most of that is just the way it was. And here's the mechanism plate with the shutter blades, and these shutter blades are exceptionally oily and dirty. So I'll remove these. They'll all have to be cleaned. You can see how they stick together. That's one of the reasons the shutter was reluctant to open and close. We'll see how the mechanism plate behaves. the blade actuating ring, that actually moves reasonably freely. There's certainly a little bit of visible rust on that piece there. It's probably clean off straight away. Okay, so we've got the blades off there. I'm going to take out the blade actuating ring. I'm going to remove this lever. This is the lever that actuates the blade actuating ring, which actually swings it backwards and forwards. So I'm going to remove that from its post. Sometimes with shutters you will find that there's a tiny washer on here. There's not one in this case. It's just to take up a bit of slack if there's a discrepancy between the height of the post and the thickness of the lever. Let's work this off that post. It's a bit reluctant to lift off. I'll deal with that later, I think. Don't want to damage this spring. This is our spring for this lever. Be careful not to damage that. You can get it back over the post if you need to, but generally you can clean everything in place. So we've got 3 screws. Hold this retaining plate in place. Now they may or may not be all the same length. If one of them's short, there'll be a reason for it. They all look the same. With some shutters, you'll find that you need a short one because it comes up through the plate and some thinner area here where parts would otherwise be moving and you don't want to foul the movement. Okay, so we lift off the retaining plate. That'll only go on in one position. It's got a little locating rivet. This is very, very dirty and greasy. And here's the blade actuating ring, the piece that moves backwards and forwards, and as it does, it moves the pivot points of the blades so that they swing inwards or outwards. Let's have another go at getting this lever off. That's very reluctant to come off there. I'm going to slide a scalpel underneath that and lift that up. That's alright. Probably just the top of that tube that it fits over is slightly spread at the top as a result of the screw being tightened up in it. So all these pieces need to be cleaned. This is all very filthy in here. If I put this in the ultrasonic cleaner, I know from experience that the black paint that you see round in here will disappear and I'll have to put it back again. So I'll have to decide whether I can get this clean to my satisfaction without having to put it through the ultrasonic cleaner. These other components certainly can go through the ultrasonic cleaner. That's the little lever which I told you very early in the piece was bent, and that's got quite a bend to it. That'll need to be straightened up. But these other components can go in the ultrasonic cleaner. That'll get rid of all that filth, and more importantly, you can get the stuff off the top surfaces very easily with just a cotton bud and some naphtha. But getting the filth out of the crevices is it's much more efficient with the ultrasonic cleaner. So these components, I'll just put them in a little jar with some naphtha and then put the jar with its naphtha in the ultrasonic cleaner so it's surrounded by the water in the cleaner. And then I'll just give that a couple of minutes and that'll clean off all that rubbish. And this piece I think I'll clean by hand. There's just little bits of dirt and rubbish here everywhere. I can flush this out with naphtha and blow it out with air, and I'll do that is that if it looks clean enough to my satisfaction, that'll be good enough. At the moment it looks pretty awful. So that's the mechanism plate. Let's have a look here. This is the case. This has our diaphragm in it. This is very stiff. Those blades are quite oily. They can be worse than this. They can be so oily and sticky that the little pivots on the blades will pop out of their holders or even tear off the blade. This one's not quite as bad as that. Now with later shutters, they had a cutout in the plate here and here so that you could remove the screws, this screw and its mate on the other side. It held this lever in place. With the early shutters you don't have that luxury, so the lever has to stay in place, and it means that assembling them is slightly different. We've got 3 screws holding this plate in position, and I'm checking to see if they're all the same. I think they will be. On later shutters you may find that one of the screws is countersunk into the plate. These I think are all the same. And all the same length. Here they are. That plate will come off. It'll come off with or without the blades. And here are our blades. We can tip those out. Now the blades, when they're closed up as much as that, will come out as a rosette anyway. These ones are sticky with oil, so they will probably be reluctant to separate. These blades, they look like they're symmetrical, but they're not symmetrical. The pivot point at one end of the blade, this one here has been flipped up the other way, it's close to the edge of the blade here, and here it's closer to the centre line of the blade. That becomes important when we're reassembling things. I'll put those blades down there. They'll all need to be cleaned by hand. We're down to the case here, the setting lever here, and the ring fixed to the setting lever that swings those blades round on their pivot points. So let's have those 2 screws out. These screws are quite small. It's easy to strip the thread. That's a problem when you're reassembling them, not usually when you're taking them apart. It's quite a common problem, particularly with something that's very old and has been serviced many times. Sooner or later someone will overdo it, tightening the screw up, and basically they either strip the thread in the plate here or strip the thread on the shoulder screw. Now because they're a shoulder screw and they're therefore a little bit special, you can't just fish around in your parts box and find another one easily. So if you have stripped one of those out, the answer when you're reassembling everything back in the case is that you put the screw in, you tighten it down as much as it's going to go, then you support the head of the screw underneath and rivet over the thread piece at the other end to effectively create a rivet, make it into a rivet. And of course that's not going to be much fun for the next person who has to come along and service the camera, but otherwise the camera's not going to work, so there's no danger anyone would ever need to service it again if you don't do that. Okay, so I've got all these pieces here. They're all very filthy. Pieces that are not painted I can put in my ultrasonic cleaner and clean. The blades, I've never cleaned them in the ultrasonic cleaner. I don't really like the idea of that. I'm going to clean them by hand, individually, on a tissue paper here, or a paper towel with naphtha and cotton buds and an awful lot of cleaning and they'll come right. The case, as you can see here, that's absolutely filthy. There's any amount of dust and rubbish in here and old oil, products of corrosion. This I'll have to clean by hand because it's painted. And if I put that in the ultrasonic cleaner, that paint would last about 30 seconds and then it'd be gone. Long before I got that filth and dirt out anyway. Okay, to the cleaning process. I have all the components cleaned. I just did as I said I'd do. I cleaned a lot of the parts, particularly the painted parts, manually with cotton buds and naphtha, and they cleaned up very well. I was very pleased with how they turned out, including the mechanism plate. The other parts I cleaned in a small jar of naphtha in the ultrasonic cleaner, and that certainly cleaned things nicely too. The shutter blades I cleaned. I've polished those with metal polish, some Brasso. They've come up well. I did the same with the diaphragm blades. I hate polishing diaphragm blades because they're easy to accidentally bend, but they were fairly well marked, so I polished those at the same time. Then cleaned away all the metal polish very carefully with naphtha. Most important that you get all traces of the metal polish away afterwards. So I'm going to start reassembling this now. Here's the setting lever. Now the setting lever here has got quite an obvious bend, a kink in it right here and here, which has the effect of making this less than flat and effectively makes some stiffness to its movement. So it doesn't rattle loose because of course they have no click stops. So I'm just going to apply a little bit of molybdenum paste here on the back where I can see it's been rubbing, and through the centre, just so it's not completely rubbing away. And I'll need to make sure I've got this the right way round. So my shutter release will be here, the cocking lever will be here, the settings button should be at the bottom, so this wants to sit on there like that. So we've got aperture settings visible at the top. That's they seen on the shutter. The aperture scales run from here to here. I can see the little screw holes for the scales, and from here to here. So that's where we want our pointers to be, where those screw holes are visible, or in between them basically. Yep, like that and like that. Okay, so I'll just hold those pieces there. In fact, I'll do better than that. I'll stick them on top of that socket that I use for reassembling things. Here's the plate that is attached to the setting lever, and this is the part that swings the blades inwards or outwards. This has got no lubrication on it at all there. I can certainly see where there's been friction there against the case. And I've got a soft lead pencil here, graphite pencil. I'm just rubbing a bit of graphite on those spots. And in the slots where the blades are going to sit, I'll run some graphite through there too, for good measure. Now this only goes on, you can see the countersink for the screw heads, so you can see which way round this fits. and it's symmetrical, so you can put it on either way. I've got the shoulder screws. Get the screw started. Get its mate in there. Tighten those two screws up and check that I've got smooth movement. It's not loose, but it's smooth, and that's what I want. I need that action to be smooth. Now when I go to put the blades in place, I'll need this set where the aperture would be fully open. I'm just checking this against my scale here, which end of the scale I need to be at. Yes, it'll be that way. So if I've got that set round all the way there, move the inside piece fully clockwise in the case. That will be the aperture fully open, basically. I need to know that so that I can put things back where they need to be. I'm not putting the scale back on here now because it will block the movement of my pointer and potentially block the movement of my pointer and stop me being able to slide this back where I want it to be. They can go on afterwards. Yeah, no problem at all. Next thing I've got to do is assemble the diaphragm blades. Now normally when I'm doing a shutter, what I would typically do is take my assembly jig, take the plate here. One side is completely flat. That's the side that goes towards the diaphragm blades is completely flat. No dent, no indentations at all. The side that goes towards the shutter blades has 5 small recesses in it. Again, I'm just going to take that soft lead pencil, that graphite pencil, and just run that through those pivot points, because the blades have all been polished and cleaned to death and they've got absolutely nothing in the way of lubrication on them at all. Now I can start assembling the diaphragm. I've got the blades here all queued up. The pivots on these are not symmetrical, as I've mentioned before. They're closer to the centre of the blade at one end and to the outside edge of the blade at the other. Now the pivots closer to the centre line of the blade are the ones we fit into that plate. And all I have to do is go around this jig, installing all of these 10 diaphragm blades. Without dropping them. And I always find it easiest to use a toothpick to help me position these blades. And I'm swinging these in towards the centre of the jig, which will keep them all neatly placed. Now these blades are not exactly dead flat, and I can see that because of the way they're sort of lifting a bit. And that has almost certainly been caused by the oil and grease that was all over those blades. Some of the blades appear to be worse than others. Well, that would not be uncommon either. Right, so I've filled up all the holes I can see. Now I've got to pull the first blades back out of the way to expose the positions for the other blades. And I've got to do this without losing any of the blades or pulling them out of their positions. That's as far as I need to go. Don't be surprised if you can't get this all together on the first attempt. It often takes more than one attempt. It often takes more than two. But it is just a matter of patience, and practice makes perfect, of course. Alright, so all the blades are in position. Now I've got to lift these early blades over the top of the ones we've got there in place. And swing everything into place towards the centre of the jig. So everything should be even. I'm looking at the jig, I'm just trying to tell if all of those blades have stayed where they're supposed to be. I think they have. Okay, so there I've got my blades sitting in place on that plate. The plate has 3 fixing holes to screw it to the case. They're not evenly placed. 2 of them are closer together, one of them is further away across there. They line up with these 3 holes in the case here. That's where the screws are going to go. Can you see that? No, you can't see anything. These 3 screw holes here, here and here. So I'm positioning this so that the 2 screw holes close together are lined up with the 2 screw holes in the case there. I've already got this thing round at the full aperture position, and if I lift this up and over, I'm just looking to see where everything should be. I should be able to position that over those rivets, those little pivot points, give it a bit of a wiggle. You can hear them dropping into place. I'll swing that over the top, lift off the outside of my jig, and I'm looking in here. I can see that one of the pivots is not in the plate anymore here at this point. It's shifted. I have to push that blade back across. Now, before I do that, I want to get the screws started, just to keep that plate in place and hopefully prevent any other blades from falling out of position. So I'll get this screw started. I don't want to tighten these down, so I know I've got to get at least one blade back in position. So I'll line up these holes in the case. If the job had gone perfectly, of course I wouldn't have any rivets that hadn't dropped into position. But frequently things do not go perfectly. Okay, so those screws are just loosely in place. I'll just lift that out and I can see that the pivot point here is not in position and one over here is not in position. I'll see if I can manoeuvre those blades into place. That one looks promising. Yep. I've got one over here. I can see where the rivet is, it's right next to the hole. I'll just put a bit of tension on that, take that screw down a bit tighter. That pivot there is not quite in its position. Now it is. So I'll just run those screws down very lightly. I'm assuming that all the pins on the other sides of the blades fell into the slots. I don't know that because I can't see them. Let's see what happens if I move the setting lever. I'm watching those blades, seeing if that opening stays circular, seeing if there are any blades missing from the count, and it looks like there is. One of those blades is not in position. This blade here is not being picked up. Loosen those screws off very slightly. Yeah, this blade here is not in position. See if I can encourage it across. No, it's not keen. Yeah, the blade is further around here. It needs to be back to this point. Is that it? It's nearly it. That's it. It just dropped into position. So that was not a neat and elegant success, but it was a success. So there's our diaphragm all back together again. The blades are moving smoothly. They're not loose, and the reason the setting isn't loose is, as I say, there's a bend across the setting lever, particularly at this point, which applies friction between the setting lever and the case at this point, so that the setting isn't easily shifted by accident. That's all it is. Later shutters had click stops which did the same job. Okay, so that part's done. I'll just check those 3 screws are tight. I'm pretty sure they are. And I can put my aperture scales in place. I'd removed the scales from the shutter earlier in the process. I normally have to remove them when I was busy taking the thing apart and fighting with the retaining ring. One of these scales looks a little bit more worn than the other. It's probably where the user's fingers habitually sat when the camera was being used. This is a fairly old camera now. It could easily have had 30 or 40 or 50 years of use before it set out the rest of its life in the cupboard. Okay, so that's that part in place. That's our case with the diaphragm blades all in position. I can turn my attention to dealing with the mechanism plate.